Wow! After interrogation, Russian occupiers once again executed Ukrainian soldiers. Russian propagandists in Pokrovsk are already filming stories about Ukrainians waiting for the so-called Russian world. No concessions. The negotiation process is at a dead end. The Kremlin has officially rejected Trump's revised plan. The US believes that Budanov's men were wiretapping Witkoff and Ushakov. A humanitarian catastrophe in occupied Donetsk, no electricity, no water, ethnic cleansing. How the Kremlin is exterminating small ethnic groups in the war. Scapegoats have been found in Russia. 6 people received life sentences for the Crimean Bridge bombing. The Ukrainian armed forces struck a top Russian landing ship. Latvia is dismantling the railway track that leads to Russia. Hello, my name is Katerina Nesterenko, and right now, here are the top stories. But first, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so we don't lose touch with you on YouTube. Let's start with news from the front. Russian forces have occupied Luch in the Donetsk region and Vysoke in the Zaporizhia region. There is also movement near Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. This is confirmed by the deep state map.
The map has been updated. The enemy has occupied Luch in Donetsk region, Vysoke in Zaporizhia region, the Soviet occupation name is Krasne, and has also advanced near Mirnohrad in Donetsk region, Zatishia in Zaporizhia region, Morphopol in Zaporizhia region, and Pokrovsk in Donetsk region.
Deep State reports that the Russians have occupied Zelenaya Rosha and have also advanced near Vysoke and Yablokove. But that's not all. The Russians have once again resorted to shooting prisoners. West of Zelenaya Rosha, the occupiers shot 5 prisoners of war from the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The Deep State portal has published the corresponding photo evidence.
The enemy continues to disregard all norms of international law, demonstrating every aspect of its bio-trash mini-civilization. According to available information, the enemy captured the guys in the forest belt, lined them up, and after interrogation, shot them.
The situation around Pokrovsk remains tense, with fighting ongoing in the city. The East Military Group reports there is no encirclement of defense forces. Logistics are more complicated but still maintained.
Fierce fighting continues in the city, and the occupiers are sending small groups into the central part of Pokrovsk, whose task is to create footage for propaganda media. The enemy, taking advantage of the weather conditions, is trying to infiltrate the southern part of the city. Our defenders are stopping attempts by small enemy groups to advance northward. The invaders had planned to capture Pokrovsk by September, but now it's the end of November and fighting in the city continues. As a result of fierce fighting, the enemy is suffering huge losses and has already been forced to deploy reserves. And
this is just pure chaos. In Pokrovsk, local waiters appeared in videos made by Russian propagandists. These are a few residents openly welcoming Russian soldiers. The video was published by journalist Yulia Kirienko.
Pokrovsk, they've finally arrived. I'd like to call this just another piece of propaganda. But there are always those who really are waiting for them in their cities. Of course, they're just a handful, because 3 to 5 people out of a population of 60,000 before the city was destroyed isn't even 1/3%. There have been collaborators in every war throughout history. Here are ours.
Everyone who waited and finally got what they wanted stayed here. Good luck to you. Thank you.
Take care of yourself.
In addition, the Vostok military group reports that the Russians are increasing pressure on Mirnohrad, trying to cut off the logistics between Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad and to enter the city. In response, the defense forces are increasing their capabilities and deploying the necessary means to disrupt the Russians' offensive plans. The occupiers' equipment and personnel are being destroyed.
Ukrainian defenders are also actively working to disrupt the logistics of the Russian army, which has significantly reduced the number of assault operations using armored vehicles by Russia. Engineering troops have organized protective corridors and networks in those areas where it was possible. The routes for moving equipment have been brought as close as possible to the line of contact covered by air defense forces. Evacuation is carried out through these corridors, and where ground logistics are impossible and for safety reasons, heavy drones, NRK, or operations by foot groups are used. NRK is also actively used to deliver necessary supplies to positions and to evacuate the wounded. The defense forces of Ukraine are making every possible effort to stop the enemy's advance and are confidently holding certain positions. There is no encirclement of our troops. Logistics have become more complicated, but are being maintained at the necessary level.
No matter how difficult it is, our soldiers continue to hold the front and resist the Russian horde, which significantly outnumbers them. That's why I urge you to support the armed forces of Ukraine, and if you can't support them financially, write words of encouragement to them in the comments. I know they're watching us. They have no intention of giving back what's ours. No one really believed that Russia would make concessions under Trump's peace plan. In fact, they stated this officially.
We are not ready to discuss certain details of what's currently happening, including the different versions of this proposed peace plan.
Ryabkov also noted that Russia is negotiating a tension with China about ending the war in Ukraine. So there won't be peace anytime soon. Despite Trump's strong desire, writes The Telegraph.
In his usual manner, the American leader tried to push through an agreement by force of personality and a strict deadline, promoting a set of one-page theses that were supposed to lead to peace. As in the Pagazia agreement, the plan included a peace group led by Trump, a prisoner exchange, and international funding for reconstruction.
But as journalists note, unlike in Gaza, this time the initiative ran up against a leader who was not ready for peace.
There are no signs that Russia wants to reach an agreement. Then that's the crux of the matter. Peace at any cost, which the US now seems to be leaning toward, is not real peace.
Meanwhile, the New York Times reports that US Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll was intimidating Europeans with Russia's missile buildup in order to push through a peace plan unfavorable to Ukraine.
Last week, European diplomats were in Kiev to hear the Trump team's peace plan. US Army Secretary Driscoll told them that Russia is now producing missiles fast enough to accumulate significant stockpiles of long-range weapons, unlike in the early years of the war when it was launching missiles at about the same rate as it was producing them. Normally, the US would condemn Russia for stockpiling weapons, not use it as an argument in favor of a peace deal that harms Ukraine. The Trump administration continues to insist that Russia is now in a winning position, so Ukraine should agree to a peace deal as soon as possible.
Atlantic Connections writes that Trump's peace plan for Ukraine has reached a dead end, and US President J.D. Vance believed that Ukraine would not be able to refuse. And the deal fell through because of a corruption scandal. According to The Atlantic, Trump's team wants to directly exploit Ukraine's internal problems to push through the agreement. Despite this, the Russian Federation at the same time has no intention of making concessions. And in fact, The Economist writes that there will be no negotiations until the end of winter, since Russia will not agree to them.
We are still receiving proposals about a ceasefire here, there, and elsewhere. Ukrainian troops will withdraw from the territories they currently hold. Only then will the fighting stop. If they don't withdraw, we will achieve this by military means.
If you remember, not long ago, Putin approved what was supposedly Trump's peace plan. However, when it came to changing certain points, Russia once again dug in its heels. That's why it's clear to the entire civilized world that Russia does not want peace. Yes, Russia wants other people's territories and the capitulation of Ukraine. A European intelligence agency dissatisfied with the pro-Russian stance of Trump's special envoy may be behind the leak of the negotiations involving Witkoff, Ushakov, and Dmitriev. The Guardian reports this, citing a former intelligence officer.
Another former intelligence officer suggested that the leak was most likely the work of a European intelligence service outraged by Witkoff's pro-Russian stance.
Meanwhile, one former senior intelligence official told journalists that several agencies could have intercepted the call, but the most likely source was someone inside the American system.
There are various ways to intercept calls, including traditional signals, intelligence methods, cyber attacks, and access to devices, so in theory, anything is possible. But I have serious suspicions that this comes from the US side, and if that's the case, there are two organizations capable of doing it: the CIA and the NSA.
Journalists also write that Ukraine could have had a motive to leak the call. However, Kyiv would hardly dare to do this, fearing a catastrophic conflict with Washington if exposed. Ukraine might have had a motive to make this call public. Kyiv is extremely concerned about Witkoff's role in the negotiations and would like to undermine his position, as well as reveal the shocking extent of cooperation between the Kremlin and the White House advisor. However, the risk of a catastrophic conflict with the Americans in the event of exposure would likely make Ukrainian officials think twice, and the ability to trace a WhatsApp call made outside Ukrainian territory would be an impressive technical achievement for Ukrainian agencies. Meanwhile, the publication European Pravda reports that the US believes the conversation between Witkoff and Ushakov was intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence, and that the recording of the talks was leaked to the media by the GUR. In
America, in U.S. government circles, they are almost certain that this conversation was recorded by the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine.
What do you think? These high-profile leaks, whose handiwork do you think they are, so to speak? Reading the comments under previous episodes, I see that many of our viewers are from Kazakhstan, Moldova, Europe, and even the USA. We Ukrainians are very grateful for your support and proud to have such reasonable viewers. Let us know in the comments below which country you're watching us from and whether people there support our fight against the empire of evil. I always enjoy reading your comments, and in the meantime, we'll keep going. Now comes the most interesting part. Nights like these in Russia are unforgettable. In these shots, you can see just how many good drones were flying over to pay a visit to the swamp. Taganrog was the first to welcome the guest. That night, a refinery in Novokuibyshevsk, Samara region, also came under drone attack.
Cool.
This is already the third strike on this facility in 2 months. Previous attacks took place on October 19th and November 16th. The enemy knew no peace in the temporarily occupied part of Ukraine. The energy infrastructure of occupied Donetsk was hit by friendly drones. Such surprises for the occupiers are becoming routine. The Russian Tapir-class military landing ship was taken in for repairs after a drone attack, according to the SBU. A large landing ship of the Russian Federation came under fire from Ukrainian drones during an attack on the naval base in Novorossiysk on the night of November 25th. After the attack, satellite images were published on the social network X by OSINT researcher Tom Bay.
The Project 1171 Tapir-class landing ship was damaged during Ukraine's latest attack on Novorossiysk yesterday. It was spotted in the inner part of the naval base, where 2 tugboats were towing it from the dock to another protected area inside the breakwaters for repairs.
Let me remind you, on the night of November 25th in Novorossiysk, the Security Service of Ukraine, together with the Defense Forces, struck an oil terminal and the Russian Navy base. Well, what can I say? It's ambiguous. Do you like this kind of news? Like if you agree with me. In Russia, 8 people have been sentenced to life in prison in the case of the explosion on the Crimean Bridge. According to the Russian investigation, 6 entrepreneurs, a farmer and a truck driver helped Ukrainian special services blow up a truck loaded with explosives, resulting in the deaths of 5 people.
As a result of the planned and coordinated actions of the members of the organized group, on October 8, 2022, at the designated point along the route on the Crimean Bridge, an improvised explosive device was detonated. As a result of the explosion, 5 victims were killed, including the unsuspecting driver who was unaware of the criminal plan and was transporting the improvised explosive device in his truck while driving across the Crimean Bridge with his parents. A minor girl sustained multiple injuries and significant property damage was caused to the Russian Federation as well as to individuals and legal entities.
And regarding this notable and substantial property damage, which was caused by and involved the Russian Federation,
in addition, in response to the claims of the victims for compensation of material damages and moral harm, the court has jointly ordered the defendants to pay more than 7 billion rubles.
Let me remind you, the explosion on the Crimean Bridge occurred on October 8, 2022, as part of an operation by the Security Service of Ukraine, which used a truck loaded with 21 tons of explosives. As a result of the explosion, part of the bridge collapsed into the sea, and fuel tanks on the railway track caught fire. Moldova summoned the Russian ambassador, Oleg Ozerov, and handed him a note of protest over the flight of 6 Russian drones through the country's airspace. This was reported by Newsmaker. Footage appeared on social media showing a previously downed Russian drone, which had fallen in Florești, being brought to the building of the Moldovan Ministry of Foreign Affairs to demonstrate the scale of the violation. In Chisinau, the incident was called a blatant violation of sovereignty and a threat to national security. For his part, the Russian ambassador to Moldova, upon seeing the downed drone that had entered Moldova from the Odessa region, confirmed that he recognized the model. But he called the event extremely strange and hinted that the drone's crash in Moldova might have been a false flag operation. That's why, he says, the incident needs to be investigated. According to him, the number of this drone allegedly appeared on November 18th in the Kharkiv region and then, in a surprising turn, ended up near Floresht a few days later.
It landed on the roof and didn't break apart itself. And it didn't damage anything around it. But these kinds of incidents raise a lot of questions. And any expert will tell you that the number of this drone had already appeared on November 18th in the Kharkiv region. And then, suddenly, it miraculously ends up a few days later in Floresht, right? Well, I guess that's something to think about. We're just offering this to you as the press.
You're absolutely right, Kabira.
But if you look at its technical specifications, you'll see that it can't fly more than 300 kilometers.
Well, honestly, I'm not surprised. What else can you expect from the Russians when there are obvious facts, and yet the ambassador himself stands there hinting that supposedly it's Ukraine? They repaired and sent this drone to Moldova. I wonder what portion of the Moldovan population actually swallowed this character's blatant nonsense. Share your thoughts in the comments. Latvia may dismantle the railway track leading to Russia.
The government will analyze information about the possible dismantling of the railway line on the country's eastern border by the end of the year, with the participation of the national armed forces. Coordination with Lithuania and Estonia will also be important. The president, Edgars Rinkēvičs, stated that greater clarity regarding the dismantling of the railway line on the country's eastern border is expected at the beginning of next year. The tense situation on the country's eastern border will persist for a long time, and dismantling the rails is one of the possible solutions. It is expected that this issue will also be discussed by the presidents and prime ministers of the Baltic countries.
According to Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs, final decisions should be made at the beginning of 2026. Europeans themselves are convinced that Russia is heading for war in Europe, and they are preparing for a possible invasion by Putin's army like never before. NATO countries are concentrating weapons and manpower at the borders with Russia and Belarus so that the well-known European bureaucracy does not slow down the movement of equipment, weapons and military units between countries. That is why what is called a military Schengen is now being formed there. And Europeans are urgently restructuring their military-industrial complexes, following Ukraine's example.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
The threat from the Kremlin is getting closer. The European Union is preparing to confront Putin. NATO countries are concentrating weapons and troops near the borders of Russia and Belarus. At the same time, members of the European Parliament are seriously working on a military Schengen. We
must show Putin that Europe is no longer associated with impotence and democracy with weakness.
The Schengen is being prepared in close cooperation with the North Atlantic Alliance. Brussels is taking decisive steps. Among them is a plan to modernize the defense industrial complex. The European Commission has announced the timeline and presented a new package of military mobility measures. This will enable the European army to move quickly across EU territory without facing excessive bureaucracy, especially in the event of a potential threat from Russia. In
the defense industry, we will be strong if we stand together. Industrially independent, autonomous, and much less fragmented.
Ukraine is acting as an ally. The country will gain access to defense logistics.
We want to expand military mobility corridors in Ukraine. This would serve as a security guarantee, meaning we could provide faster support if needed.
First of all, it is necessary to modernize the infrastructure, digitize procedures, and increase funding. One of the key challenges for EU countries remains ensuring the rapid transportation of troops to potential conflict zones. We
can respond to these threats either symmetrically or asymmetrically. We have the full arsenal of tools at our disposal. At
the moment, the threat to the Baltics remains. And in the event of a sudden escalation, for example, the French army would need to cover about 1,500 kilometers to come to the aid of its allies. Although light units are able to move relatively quickly, heavy equipment requires significantly more time and preparation.
Currently, European bridges and railways are not suited for the rapid movement of tanks, soldiers, and military cargo. If transported from the west to the eastern flank, tanks could get stuck in tunnels, tangled in complex bureaucracy, and bridges might not withstand the passage of these vehicles.
Drawing on the experience of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, the European Union has devoted significant attention to modernizing critical infrastructure. Transport routes will be upgraded to dual-use standards so that they can serve both civilian and military needs simultaneously. The military Schengen plays a special role in strengthening the defense of the Eastern Alliance, especially for the Baltic countries and Poland.
Everything depends on our position. Will we be able to deter the enemy, or will we encourage them to act aggressively?
But not everyone sees the danger coming from Russia, or they simply try to turn a blind eye to reality by maintaining close ties with the Kremlin dictator Putin.
We're talking about an armament program that will require us to spend every last penny. And this concerns all of Europe. From the statements of several influential leaders, it is quite clear that they want to enter the war.
Germany is doing everything it can to help Ukraine, making every effort to equip the Ukrainian armed forces with long-range missile systems, as well as to organize joint production on our territory.
For several months now, we have been working intensively with the Ukrainian government on implementing long-range weapons projects. The Ukrainian army is being equipped with such systems. We have agreed not to discuss the details publicly, as we believe the Russian side should not be informed about the extent of our military support. I can only say that we are doing everything possible to equip the Ukrainian army with weapon systems of the necessary range. And the number of such systems will increase in the coming weeks and months if necessary, up to and including the production of such weapons within Ukraine itself.
The European Union's military budget is planned to be increased to more than 17 billion euros. In total, at least 100 billion euros are needed to modernize bridges and tunnels and to fully launch 4 corridors for military needs in the European Union. Putin's words cannot be trusted based on Ukraine's experience.
There's no need to make things up and then form an opinion about Russia based on those inventions. There's no need to create an image of Russia as the enemy. For example, they made up the idea that Russia wants to attack NATO. Are you completely out of your mind or what? You're as dumb as this table. Who came up with this? It's nonsense, you understand? It's utter nonsense.
While the dictator is feeding journalists lies, members of the European Parliament are calling for regular joint exercises and loading tests. They want the European Union to follow NATO's example so that rapid reaction forces can respond swiftly to Kremlin aggression.
Jokes in terrorist Russia. Putin has instructed the government to create an objective perception of Russia abroad as a democratic and law-based state. This follows from the approved national policy strategy until 2036. We'll tell you just how far Putin's Russia is from being a democratic state next.
Putin has once again decided to stir things up.
Please, do not slow down the pace of accomplishing the assigned tasks.
Now, by order of the Kremlin's master, officials must convince foreigners that Russia is, above all, about democracy and the rule of law.
Just today, Volodin, who's the Speaker of the State Duma, started announcing to everyone, he's the Speaker of the State Duma, started telling everyone that apparently foreigners are now fleeing to Russia from this so-called damned Europe. Why, what do you think? For freedom of speech?
Thus, shaping an objective opinion abroad about Russia as a state governed by the rule of law is part of the Kremlin's strategy until 2036.
Let's suppose for a moment that one day the war will finally end, or at least come to a halt. That doesn't mean the Kremlin will just stash away its main ambitions somewhere in a closet, nothing of the sort. As long as Putin is in power, his main ambitions remain in place. They're not going anywhere. What is his main ambition? His main ambition isn't even Ukraine. Putin's biggest ambition today is to redefine the world so that he can bring all the countries of the former Eastern Bloc back under his influence.
But still, who is this mostly aimed at? Is it aimed more at Russians themselves to boost their patriotic spirit or at an external audience?
Officials don't need to explain all this to the Russian voter. The Russian voter understands perfectly well that none of this is real. But it's the Western people who need to have it all explained to them, how great things are in Russia, how wonderful everything is here, and how bad everything is in the West. So in the West, everything is terrible. They have no freedom of speech, nothing at all. They're all being deceived, those poor souls. And they're even being deprived of cheap Russian oil and gas because everyone is just so awful.
So in words, it's a paradise, equal rights, freedoms, traditional values. But in reality, it's repression, restrictions, and criminal liability for expressing an opinion.
That's something that doesn't exist. So what freedoms are there in Russia today? None at all, literally none. You can't speak, you can't gather, and there are no elections either. In other words, there are no civil liberties whatsoever. So what is there to tell? To what Western person could you talk about how good life is in Russia? I'm not even talking about purely economic issues. Like just today, we read that the Russian government has started up the printing press because the budget deficit is simply enormous.
Well, that's the catch. Besides fairy tales about the right Russia, the Kremlin also wants to step up the promotion of Russian culture and traditional values abroad. In other words, it's not enough for them to influence other countries. They want even more.
I would say that, unfortunately, Putin is quite effective in this propaganda strategy of his. And then when Trump came to power in the United States, a man who seems to think all this is nonsense and who maybe even genuinely believes that Putin stands for traditional values, although what kind of traditional values are those if Putin himself doesn't even have a family? What traditional values are we even talking about, honestly? And
what's funny is that Putin presents all of this as some kind of fight against Russophobia. The document is also intended to help preserve the unity of the people and the territorial integrity of the country.
How is Putin's propaganda different from Soviet propaganda? The difference is that Putin pours huge amounts of money into propaganda. On the one hand, and on the other hand, they operate in a technologically competent way. That is, they take and use all modern methods.
A heavy burden has fallen on the shoulders of Russian officials. But why them specifically? Doesn't Russia have other, more reliable and familiar ways to exert influence?
For officials, it's more of a kind of scare tactic. Because as we know, officials really love vacationing in Europe. And accordingly, when this is said to them directly, it's also a warning. Don't even think about going anywhere without approval. It must be said that nowadays in Russia, you really can't go anywhere without approval, because almost like in Soviet times, foreign passports are being confiscated.
Russia is trying to build a beautiful facade, which it has destroyed itself. But the world isn't blind either, and in the Kremlin's case, actions don't match the pretty words at all.
It's easy to rake in the heat with someone else's hands, or how Moscow wages war using indigenous peoples. In fact, analysts report that today the Republic of Bashkortostan is the leader in the number of casualties in the war in Ukraine.
8,000 residents of the Republic of Bashkortostan have died in the war. Given the geometric progression of rising losses, by 2026 the number of deaths could reach 12,000 residents of Bashkortostan.
According to analysts, the highest number of losses was recorded in the winter of 2024 to 2025, with 1,112 people. Meanwhile, 12% of those killed had spent less than a month in the combat zone. It is important to understand that the real number of losses may be twice as high, taking into account the wounded and those missing in action. And while in Bashkiria, families are burying their husbands, brothers and children who died in the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin is launching memorial campaigns for the fallen. Just listen to this. Memorial events in kindergartens.
Memorial events were held in kindergartens, schools, and other educational institutions of Bashkiria in honor of the 8,000 residents of the region who died in the war. Children laid flowers in memory of those who participated in the war in Ukraine and drew pictures. The administrations of educational institutions reported on the event using the VK hashtag 8,000heroes, as noted by Astra.
I apologize, but these children need fathers, not memorial events. But it seems the Kremlin doesn't see it that way. Hysteria in the swamps. Russia is not panicking, even though the Ukrainian FP-2 strike drone is capable of carrying a 100-kilogram FAB aerial bomb. The Soviet-made aerial bomb is used without its tail section. What does this mean for the enemy directly on the front line? We'll tell you more in the following report.
The Russian Federation's worst nightmare, or rather the reason it can't sleep, is the new Ukrainian strike drone, the FP-2. The FP-2 is used to strike at the Russian rear. It can also carry an adapted aerial bomb as its warhead.
And the FP-2 drone is specifically designed for strikes. In particular, it uses a penetrating warhead. It's not soft like regular drones. Instead, it uses a 100-kilogram Fab 100 bomb with the tail section removed as its warhead. So this drone can strike targets quite effectively, because the FAB 100, for example, was the main bomb of World War II and the most widely used bomb. At the same time, it can hit targets with high precision.
Information about the use of these drones is confirmed both by the occupiers and by Ukrainian soldiers themselves, who show them in action against the enemy across the Donbass. The OFAB marking indicates that this is a fragmentation high-explosive munition designed to destroy unprotected and lightly protected targets.
The FP-2 can strike both stationary targets and in certain cases moving targets as well. And this is a very important point because, for example, it allows you to strike at Iskander missile launchers as they move into position.
The Ukrainian company Firepoint has introduced the FP-2 strike drone in the middle strike class. It replicates the design of the long-range FP-1 drone, which is used to strike targets in the rear of the Russian army.
This is, so to speak, a modernization of the long-range FP-1 drone, which has a range of up to 1,400 kilometers. And the FP-2 has kept the same design, but is smaller in size, apparently with a shorter wingspan. And its range is limited to 200 kilometers. This is where the main concentration of army and front-level depots and logistics centers is located. That's why this strike zone is very important.
The manufacturers offer the system both with a classic stationary launcher and a mobile version for rapid deployment, disguised as a regular army truck.
You can drive up as close as possible, say within 10 kilometers of the front line, quickly launch and then quickly leave the strike zone.
It is noted that the relative affordability and availability of drones, combined with a heavy warhead, allows Ukraine to a certain extent to compensate for the shortage of high-precision missile weaponry.
The FP-2 can be considered a high-precision munition. Why is that? It is equipped with a camera. A relay is suspended in the area, let's say, within 10 kilometers of the front line. And this drone flies like an FPV, meaning it has a camera on board. It strikes the target with precision. In other words, the operator sees the target before striking it.
Experts point out that due to their low flight altitude and sheer numbers, drones can bypass and overwhelm the Russian army's air defense systems, which in certain situations can be more effective than strikes from HIMARS missile systems.
Germany is providing Ukraine with emergency military aid amounting to 170 million euros. This was announced by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. In addition, according to him, Germany is increasing its aid to Ukraine to 11.5 billion euros in 2026.
Germany will continue to support Ukraine at a very high level in the federal budget for 2026. Given recent events, we have increased this amount by another 3 billion euros, bringing the total to 11.5 billion euros. And we are immediately providing an additional 170 million euros for infrastructure to mitigate the impact of Russian terrorism on Ukraine's winter supplies.
The Chancellor emphasized that Germany will support Ukraine for as long as it takes and plans to make frozen Russian assets available specifically for this purpose. In addition, Merz welcomed the efforts of the United States to bring the war to an end, but stressed that Ukraine and Europe do not want peace through capitulation and will not accept negotiations behind their backs.
Putin must realize that he has no chance of winning this war at the expense of Europeans and the European order of peace. An agreement concluded between great powers without the consent of Ukraine and without the consent of Europeans will not become the foundation for a true and lasting peace in Ukraine. When it comes to European affairs, decisions can only be made with the agreement of Europe. Europe is not a toy in someone else's hands, but a sovereign actor defending its own interests and values. In this conflict, there is only one aggressor. Naming him is a prerequisite for the internal clarity needed to resolve this conflict. And for real negotiations to even become possible, Putin must be shown the futility of his military adventure.
What do you think of Germany's position? Do you support it? Write what you think in the comments. We'll definitely read them. How do you like our news? Let us know what we should change to become better. We will definitely take it into account. And for now, give this video a like to support what we do. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Ukraine Today so you don't miss the next episodes. See you!